Good afternoon, everyone. It's 3 o'clock, so we are going to begin our second series of the pandemic and the common good teach-in that we've been holding and will be continue to hold over the course of April. My name is Shelley Inglis. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Executive Director of the Human Rights Center here at UD, and we are organizing this along with Professor Kelly Johnson, who is the Father Feree Chair for Social Justice. We have an exciting lineup of excellent speakers today, and today our focus is on the social justice implications of the pandemic, the COVID-19 virus, and what it means for us as we look towards Good Friday and Easter. The social justice implications, and while they also resonate throughout the other parts of our series, today focus really on the most vulnerable in our community and what it means, this pandemic means in terms of their rights and how we should be viewing the common good from the lens of those who are most at the margins of our society. I'm going to briefly reflect on the fact that many of the people who are most vulnerable are often the most unseen in our regular day-to-day life when we aren't social distancing and we're out in public. Many of the people that we're talking about do not play particularly public roles or do not have access and equal access to public spaces. Many of these people and these groups are confined or set off from society, are placed in institutions or in frameworks that limit their access to public space. And we're going to be talking about not only the health and social implications of this pandemic on them, but also their rights in the context of a pandemic and what it means to be able to see their rights fully realized. And here we will be looking at a broader framework of rights, including civil and political rights. So our rights to participate in public life, our rights to participate, to assemble, to participate in our democracy, and other forms of what we call in the human rights world, civil and political rights, which are also being implicated in this pandemic, not only for the most vulnerable, but for everyone. So with that, let me start off by welcoming our first speaker, who just had a conversation piece published on pandemic and the history of pandemic. Megan Henning is a professor of religious studies here, and she is going to be speaking about the history of pandemics and the implication of pandemics on our understanding of ableism, ability, and disability. Megan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be able to be with the UD community in this way today and to get to reflect specifically on the ways in which the study of the ancient world and the work that I do on disability studies pertains to the moment that we find ourselves in today. So I'm going to start by first opening up the slide deck. I'm having trouble doing the screen sharing because the host has to enable that. So I'm going to start by talking about the work that I've done on the city as a body and the way in which disease spread and pandemic worked in the ancient world and the way that that revealed social values in the ancient world, and then connect that to today. And then I'm going to end with some thoughts on how our understanding of bodies and disability in the contemporary world is working in two very specific ways with respect to the global pandemic. There we go. Thank you. Okay. All right. So um, when I started to think with my co-author candidate about the city as a body, I realized that the polis, the ancient city-state, really functioned much like a human body. Almost exactly the way that they thought about the body is the way that they thought about their cities. But of course, a city does not have an epidermis to protect it, but instead has city walls. And you protect the city by patrolling those walls and who comes in and out, just the way that you protect what enters and leaves the body in antiquity, especially with their humoral theories of medicine. To describe this as a metaphor doesn't quite capture the depth of the relationship between the city and the body. The way in which the mechanics of social containment worked for the city is exactly how people treated physical disease in the medical texts. And so if the city-state is a body, there's going to be moments of crisis where that body needs to be cleansed, healed, purified in order to keep it healthy and avert disaster. But then this raises the question, how do you do that in a world with no disinfectant and no Lysol wipes? And so in the ancient world, the way that this worked was through the pharmakos ritual. They saw blood as the most potent of detergents, and they had an ancient ritual called the pharmakos ritual that allowed for the city-state to be purified. So in the pharmakos ritual, what would happen is a person or persons, sometimes one male and one female, would be selected. They would be fed with the poor quality food that was usually reserved for slaves, beaten with twigs from a wild fig tree, sometimes dressed in holy garments, and then driven from the city. And in some cases, the texts indicate that not only were they driven from the city and exiled through this ritual practice, but we have at least one example where they are stoned to death, and lots of other examples that indicate that the person would also be killed. So through this ritual, we get this idea that the city was cleansed by this expulsion of the pharmakos, and this would be used to avert plagues or famines. And while some later commentators had suggested that it was kings or priests or virgins who would be selected as the pharmakos, for example, Oedipus has been compared to a pharmakos figure. In reality, in antiquity, it was really the poor or the lowborn, slaves, criminals, someone who was excessively ugly, or described by the ancient sources as deformed. People in antiquity didn't use this term, but in our parlance, it would also be persons with disabilities. And we get evidence for this in Strabo, in Plutarch, in Hipponax, in Aristophanes. An ancient commentary on Aristophanes suggests specifically that it was those who were mistreated by nature. So it's not only the case that the pharmakos is a person who's selected by the community and sometimes someone who has been convicted as a criminal, but it seems that it's always the case that the city was cleansed through the bodies of the marginalized. And then the word itself, you might have already noticed as I'm saying it, sounds a lot like our modern word for pharmacy. And that is because that's where we get that word. So in antiquity, the ancient medical authors think about, so these words are closely related, they think about drugs, pharmakon, as something that has the ability to both heal and to kill. So a drug could be thought of as a life-giving remedy, but also as a poison. And that is why medical authors were very, very careful about prescribing them as sort of a last resort, because they wanted to make sure that it was necessary. Scholars can't tell whether it is that the person that was designated as the pharmakos was thought to be the root of all the city's problems, and so a poison that needs to be expelled from the body, or whether it's thought of as a cure that needs to be brought forth in order to cure the body. But either way, the language is explicitly medical and points to the ancient medical idea that drugs were both extraordinarily powerful and could kill or cure. And so when we turn to think about what does the pharmakos ritual mean for today, we might think, well, that's really troubling and deeply disturbing that people in antiquity all the way through the Middle Ages were doing this. And we want to kind of distance ourselves from that. But this idea that it's the marginalized that are made to be the pharmakos is not something that kind of comes out of nowhere and is simply part of the barbarism of antiquity. What we see there is that the cultural values that the Greeks, that the Romans already had are rising to the surface in a crisis. So when the city's at a moment of crisis, the cultural values that they have about certain people and people groups are bubbling to the top. And so the question that this raises for us in our contemporary moment of crisis and of global pandemic, specifically with respect to disease, is what are the social values that are rising to the surface as we are dealing with our own pandemic and trying to purify and cleanse our city states. And what we see is that in some cases, we are not faring much better than our ancient forebears. So we see, for example, so those of us who are able are socially distancing, but of course there are lots of people who are not able to do this. And it's frequently those who already had greater social inequality to begin with. So people who are not in a socioeconomic position to social distance are now at even greater risk in this pandemic. We also know I've got some links there for you that, of course, people who are already socially marginalized have greater susceptibility to an outbreak like this. There's a study there about flu in Connecticut that was done at New Haven Hospital, where they just tracked cases of the flu, and it was quite clear that flu outbreaks were higher in socioeconomic disadvantaged populations. So the poor of New Haven had much higher likelihood of being hospitalized for the flu in that given year that they were doing the study in 2015. Economic disparities frequently translate to health disparities. So since we know that this particular disease targets or is most dangerous for people that have pre-existing conditions, and we know that poverty frequently leads to health disparities and greater instances of pre-existing conditions, those of lower socioeconomic status are just naturally going to be more at risk to have complications and even to die from contracting COVID-19. And then there's also the socio and economic fallout of the pandemic as well. So I have some other links there about how, for example, in China, migrant workers are having difficulty finding work, even as society is starting to try to return to some kind of normal economic state because of the social stigma that's associated with the rural areas where the outbreak was more virulent in China. And so there is a way in which there's real difficulty that is lasting as a result of, oh dear, yes, I have been going through the slides. Yikes, okay, let's see what's happening. Can you see the slides now? I'm so sorry. Okay. I'll try to just start over on the sharing. Okay, we'll just continue without the PowerPoint. All right, so the other way in which the marginalized are our social values around the body are rising to the surface in this particular moment is around disability and the pandemic. So what we are seeing is the way in which everyday ableism is becoming more obvious as a result of this particular public health crisis. So ableism is the idea that one kind of body labeled by our culture as normal is better than another kind of body. And then ableism is also the discrimination and social stigma against persons with disabilities. So when we first were dealing in the early days of this, on February 29th, Alexander Brodsky on Twitter tweeted out a friendly reminder: people who will be high-risk patients if we get coronavirus can actually hear you when you reassure everyone that we're the only ones who might die. And what she's saying in that tweet is that people are, of course, trying to encourage one another not to panic in this social moment that we were having. But in doing so, when they would say, well, it's only the elderly and the sick who will die, that was communicating to people that there was low or no social value on those persons' bodies. And that the reason that that was so comfortable for people to say is because we've all internalized this idea that some bodies are less valuable than others. So it's not that there's like some bad, evil group of people out there that are ableist, and then most of the rest of us are good and don't have these values. It's a shared social value set that informs our culture every day. And most of the time, we don't think about it in everyday life unless it directly impacts us. And in the global pandemic, it's directly impacting all of us. So it affects persons with disabilities in the sense that their bodies are being minimized. They are less likely to receive proper medical care in this situation as a result of that. But also, it impacts the temporarily able-bodied as well. And so I am a temporarily able-bodied person. And one of the foundational things in disability studies is this idea that the truth of the human condition, right, is such that even the temporarily able-bodied are only inhabiting a so-called normal body for part of their lives. We will all one day be disabled. And so if you look at a definition of disability, for example, right, disability is simply the idea that you're not able, right, that people are either through physical or mental or other kinds of bodily differences are not able to carry out the function of their daily life, right? According to that definition, we are all disabled right now, right? We are all having to modify the way in which we carry out our daily life tasks in some way because of our bodily vulnerability. And so what has happened is that by virtue of this global pandemic, the one day in which all of our bodies eventually become disabled has come much, much sooner than we expected. And what persons with disabilities are starting to reflect on is that y'all temporarily able-bodied people, myself included, are not all handling this super well, right? Most people who become disabled at some point in their life, later in their life, go through a period of difficult transition, right, to dealing with their new normal and also coming into contact with the values of the body that they previously held. So I'll just leave us with a quote from Kate Bowler, who's a theologian who has been doing public theology around her own cancer diagnosis and her own chronic illness and disability for some time now. Kate Bowler was diagnosed with colon cancer 4 years ago and spent 2 years in treatment and consequently has a vulnerable immune system. And she says, it's opened up to me a whole world of people just like me who are living in precarity, that feeling that things can be given and taken away in a single moment, she says. And so we're seeing people try to experience and understand their own fragility in a culture that really prefers to narrate itself as invincible. So I think that's where we are. We're at this cultural moment where we typically like to think of ourselves as invincible, but we're being brought to confront the reality that normality is a myth and that we're all really vulnerable.
Thanks so much, Megan. We have a time now for question and answer. If you're interested to engage with Megan, please let Kelly Johnson know and she will unmute you and enable your video. So you can also use your raising hand function, which will make it clear if you have a question.
Okay. Hi, Megan. This is Erin.
Hi.
I missed the beginning. I came in a little late, so I don't know, maybe you already addressed this, but I was just wondering if you could comment on the particular instance a couple weeks ago. I think it was the governor of Louisiana, I believe, who commented on the fact that some lives would just have to be lost. I think he was referring to the elderly, and that was just going to have to be sort of a collateral damage of this pandemic, and that was just what we would have to do. Or maybe it was Texas. I'm to think
it was Texas. It was the lieutenant governor of Texas, I think. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, perfect. So kind of down in that region, and essentially saying, like, putting this sort of lives, some lives may have to be lost, but at the cost of the economy, and kind of making this calculus, which is interesting coming from Texas, and just thinking about pro-life issues and like how expansive or lack of how that's conceptualized in certain ways, in certain contexts. So I didn't know if you just had any comments on that, just in terms of valuing life. I don't know if that would be considered a disability, just elderly, but just thought I'd get your comments.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, so yes, the elderly who are more vulnerable because of this are considered, according to disability studies, that is a disability. Mm-hmm. And specifically his comments, my understanding is that he was saying that he would be willing to sacrifice his own body as a person over 65 for the good of the economy. And that was something that was needed, that people needed to be willing to sacrifice themselves and their bodies in order for the economy to flourish. And to be sure, I agree with him that this is a moment where we have a lot of different kind of intersecting marginalization, right? So the poor are absolutely also marginalized to a greater degree in this moment. But I would like us to come up with solutions, and I think I would be with all disability studies scholars on this. I would like us to come up with solutions that don't involve people needing to die on behalf of others. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was really stunned by his statements, and for exactly the same reasons that you suggested, that he is coming from a state that is typically pro-life. And so I don't think that calling people to die on behalf of others, or even suggesting that you yourself would, is particularly helpful. What that does is encapsulates this idea that, again, that some bodies are less valuable than others. One of the things that I said, even if you don't care about the disabled or the elderly yourself, you should be able to do the calculus that one day you're hoping that you'll get old, and you would not want people to think about your body this way, right? You should be really careful about how you talk about old people in front of your children, right? That's just that's an important thing to think about.
Reframing.
Yeah. So even if you want to come from completely like, what is in this for me, that you should, this is still, if you're playing the long game, right? This is still the bodies of the disabled are not just those other people out there, right? it's about all of our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And the way in which the reality of disability is that we all inhabit different bodies, right? Our culture has a myth of normality, that there's a normal body that's better, and we all want to ultimately conform to that, but it doesn't take long in life for you to realize that that's just straight up not true, right? So right, you and I are both wearing glasses. We know that,
Exactly.
that we without certain assistive technologies would not be able to do our life every day. And here we are on Zoom, right, using a different kind of assistive technology to do our life when the vulnerability of our bodies makes that necessary.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks so much, Megan. We are going to now give everybody a moment to stretch and transition to our next speaker, who is Miranda Hallett, a professor of cultural anthropology. She's going to speak on the impact on migrants and refugees of the pandemic. So we will pause the recording and restart in 3 minutes. Thanks so much. So we're back. I see Miranda is with us. And I wanted to mention up front that we will be making available Megan's slides. Apologies for the technical glitch with sharing her slides, but those will be made available along with the recording of all the series on the Human Rights Center's website. For now, we're right back on time, and I'm going to start the recording and hand it over to Miranda Hallett, as I said, professor of cultural anthropology, and she's going to speak about the impact of the pandemic from the perspective of migration and refugee rights.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this topic. I have a lot of passion about it. So some of you may have heard me speak about immigrants' rights in other contexts on campus before now. So I do have some slides to share as well. Hopefully these will work because I've got some cool stuff in there. All right, so can I have a confirmation from someone that you can see my slides? Maybe by the text. Okay, so I'm going to speak a little bit about migration, pandemics, and the common good. I'll stay away from conceptualizations around the common good largely and stick to kind of information about what's happening, some of the ethical issues. In particular, so it's a way too broad a topic for me to cover everything. So I'm going to very briefly talk about the general response to COVID and how it relates to immigration policy, very broadly, as in like globally, what are the trends? Then I'm going to take a moment to talk about why immigrant communities in the United States are facing specific and distinct risks. I'll list out some of those risks. And then I'll spend most of the time really talking about immigration detention. There was an Amnesty International report that just came out yesterday, as of this recording, April 7th, 2020, about the imminent disaster that could be happening in immigrant detention centers if detainees are not released in large numbers. Okay. So some of you may be aware that the most common response by far to coronavirus was to add more restrictions on people's movement using immigration law. So at least 174 countries have put new travel restrictions in place. Most often this was the very first thing that countries did. It seems logical, but on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about why those steps may not have actually worked as well as you might assume that they would. And so as a byproduct of this, refugee and asylum systems have been shut down or suspended in many places. Pathways to residency, pathways to refugee status have been foreclosed or blocked, even more so than was already happening. And anti-immigrant sentiment and medical racism has increased. And this is in a context where there was already a wave of sort of xenophobic politics, as some of you may be aware, in many parts of the world, Europe, the United States, and Australia in particular. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you an image demonstrating that we should perhaps question the assumption that border controls can effectively slow the spread of the virus, right? And this chart is made using data from Johns Hopkins University mostly, although the US data, I think, has some other sources because of the spottiness of the data collection that has happened in the United States. So this chart shows countries that did enact travel restrictions against China in red, those are the red lines, and those that did not in blue. And you can see that all of the countries that are having the biggest problems right now did enact travel restrictions against China and enacted them fairly quickly. So I watched a webinar with a migration and public health expert a week ago speaking about why this is the case, why this might not have functioned. And she gave several reasons. One is that no country's been able to actually stop all traffic across borders. It's not realistic to stop it. So every single travel ban that was put in place had a lot of exceptions and sort of mobility privileges for certain persons that were moving from high-risk areas to low-risk areas. And so those really failed to forestall the spread of the virus. The measures were not based on evidence or on advice from public health experts, but tended to be based on prejudices and assumptions about where the virus was and where it was likely to be and what kinds of persons were likely to carry it, that were very false and that were based on social prejudice rather than sound information. And then finally, one reason why it failed is that while it may have slowed the curve a bit in some countries, many of the countries, including the United States, did not put in place other measures in the meantime, right? So we all know that in Ohio, or many of us know that in Ohio, the curve is being successfully flattened. Well, while that curve is being flattened, there's a hum of activity. There's an attempt to get more tests, to get ventilators, to prepare hospitals, to get more staffing, and so on, so that when that peak comes, there's a system in place to address it. Well, many of these countries put in place travel bans and did not do what public health experts were suggesting that they do because those internal measures would have been more costly or costly to citizens who would protest against them, right? So widespread testing contact tracing, required widespread physical distancing, and often the mechanisms that you could use to achieve this sometimes to require surveillance or some kinds of social controls that publics are very uncomfortable with. And so these travel bans were put in place as a sort of a socially acceptable way to respond, but they weren't very effective. And in fact, what they've done is really just contribute to that sort of sense of xenophobia, that perception that letting foreigners move across the border into one's country is inherently a risky act. The CDC, for example, released an order declaring any unauthorized migrants as public health threats. And when they did this, there were far, far more cases in the United States than there were in Latin America, which continues to be the case. So it's these kinds of irrational policies that I'm talking about. So moving on, I wanted to talk about how the general impacts on migrants. So one of them is that many migrants who are not eligible to receive federal aid, even if they pay taxes. So anybody who has an undocumented person in the household is ineligible for some of the federal funding right now, which is going to affect a lot of low-income families, a lot of immigrant families, mixed status families, and is going to make it much harder for them to economically weather this storm. I've also been reading some material about how legal residents are at risk of losing their residency because USCIS, which is the bureaucratic arm that processes paperwork, has largely shut down its processes, its hearings. A lot of the office processing is not happening anymore, but enforcement is still happening. And so that leaves immigrants who may be in kind of a process of getting their status in a dangerous situation and very anxious, not only about their health, but also about their legality. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, in terms of one of the most fundamental human rights, the right to life, there's a greater risk of death from coronavirus for many immigrants. And that comes from different issues. So as an intersectional matter, immigrant communities tend to be disproportionately represented among the very poorest and the most marginalized, among those that most lack health insurance, most lack secure employment or a reliable paycheck. And so they're going to be incentivized strongly to work even when they're sick because it's a matter of survival. Some also tend to disproportionately work in at-risk industries. So farm workers, who are definitely necessary workers to feed us all right now, are disproportionately foreign-born people. Same with home health aides and caregivers broadly. There's just a very high percentage of representation within the labor markets for health fields, from the low end to the very specialized high end of foreign-born people. So there are many of the frontline workers, there's a disproportionate representation of immigrant communities. Prisons and detention centers do not ensure adequate social distancing, so that's a real issue. And then finally, many asylum seekers and refugees are stuck in dangerous border zones because of these mobility controls that I mentioned. And then finally, legal marginalization more broadly and the scapegoating of immigrants and prejudice against immigrants can cause social distance and social withdrawal in the unhealthy sense, right? So one of the things that this expert said on the webinar I watched was that once community spread has started to happen, one of the most important public health things to do is to focus on reaching out to pockets of vulnerable people, and especially those who might lack trust in public authorities. And that this is absolutely crucial because people, for the good of everyone, people need to feel comfortable coming forward and saying they are sick, right? Even migrant workers, unauthorized people, detained and incarcerated people as well. So for this slide, I wanted to give a bit of credit to my colleague, Dr. Andrea Timmer, who's also a cultural anthropologist, works at the University of Virginia. She prepared this slide and she's been looking into similar issues. It's a real problem that there's been a shutdown of the asylum system. Things were already very difficult for people who were displaced prior to the coronavirus outbreak. As I mentioned, over the past 20, 30, 40 years even, there's been increasingly xenophobic and anti-immigrant politics in various places around the world. So this has led to the consolidation of people who are seeking refugee status, who are displaced people, cannot go back to their homes in camps that have very, very poor conditions. very inadequate living conditions, a lack of hygiene facilities for people, lack of public sanitation, as you see in this picture of a camp in Greece. Right, so similar to the issue of homelessness in the U.S. context, right? This is essentially like transnational homelessness, and there's a departure of volunteers. Camps are being closed down, and people are being thrown out on their own in very stark situations, leading to disproportionate levels of death. So for the rest of the time, as I mentioned, I want to talk about immigration detention. This is the report that just came out yesterday from Amnesty. And if you look through the table of contents, you can see they give some really good, I haven't read this all yet because it just came out less 24 hours ago. But there's really solid information about ICE's response, why it's not just inadequate, but really reckless. And the good reasons why immigrant detainees should be released now to protect public health. Some of you are probably aware that immigration detention is already problematic. It's already been subject to criticism on the basis of human rights principles, right? And on the basis of poor and inadequate conditions in immigration detention centers. There's very well documented lack of adequate medical care, substandard food, failure to provide sufficient living space, and even a failure to provide basic hygiene supplies like soap or access to running water. Just a few quick details about the mass incarceration of immigrants. We're by far the country in the world that locks up more people for non-criminal civil immigration reasons than any other country. We have around 42,000 people at any given time in immigration custody, and that leads to several 100,000 per year. At any given time, there are also many children that are locked up in ICE custody, and that number is especially high right now. So 10 years ago, there were less than 100 kids locked up in ICE custody, but for reasons that I'm going to talk about very briefly in a second, right now we have a lot of children who are detained in immigration custody as well. By far the most, the vast majority of people who are detained in immigration prisons are asylum seekers. So people who have a legal claim that is in process, where they're maybe working with a lawyer, but at the very least they have a hearing and they have a date that they're going to go before an immigration judge to hear their case for refugee status. The other people that you would most commonly find in ICE detention are people who maybe were unauthorized and lived in the country for a while and then were apprehended by ICE. And the people who spend the most time detained are the people, ironically, who have the best cases, the best chance to finally be found to have had a right all along to reside in the United States. And even according to the law, this is a common misperception that people have, is that the government is obligated to keep people locked up because it's a sort of a public security issue. They've done something wrong, and in order to keep the public safe, they need to be locked up. But the reality is, even according to the government, immigrant detention is not a punishment for any wrongdoing, and it's not a matter of public security. It is to make sure that the people who are detained show up for their hearings. But it's been demonstrated again and again that there are many other far more cost-effective and humane ways to just keep in touch with people and make sure that they are likely to show up to their hearings. Over the last 5 to 7 years, we've had pretty low rates of border crossings and border apprehensions, certainly compared to the prior decades, right, when we had many peaks that were way higher than the numbers of people crossing the border now. However, the demographic has changed. So the green part of this bar on the chart that I'm showing, which runs from the 1960s right up to 2019, shows family groups who are apprehended by the Border Patrol. And when families are migrating together, it's a pretty sure sign of a refugee flow, of a movement of displaced people, not of labor migrants. Labor migrants tend to be adults traveling alone. So this is one of the reasons why immigration has become such a visible issue, and in particular, the detention or the locking up of families who are seeking asylum from Central America. So wrote this article in 2017. It was based on research that we had done during the Obama administration about these concerns about immigrant family detention. And just on these three charts that I'm going to show you now, it demonstrates who this demographic shift and how much it has ramped up even over the last 3 years, despite the fact that we're not hearing as much about migration and asylum seekers from Central America anymore this year in 2019 or 2020. It's still a huge issue and it's still happening and in fact is increasing. So keep an eye on the orange part of this pie because the orange part of the pie represents families. This pie chart shows 2017. The share of the families jumps significantly in fiscal year 2018. And this is fiscal year 2019, which we just finished. Another thing that a lot of people are not aware of is that immigration detention facilities are all over the country. And so the possibility of an outbreak in immigrant detention, which could rapidly spread through multiple detention centers due to ICE's practice of frequently transferring inmates between different facilities, detainees between different facilities, it's a risk not only to the people who are incarcerated themselves, but also to the guards and to the communities that the guards go back to when they leave these overcrowded spaces where infectious disease is likely to spread. So this map is from that Amnesty report that I was showing you, and it shows the detention facilities in our region. The closest family detention center where children are locked up to us is in Berks, Pennsylvania, Berks Family Residential Center right there. At this point, I want to show you a very short video. You can see it's less than 2 minutes long, made by women in a detention facility about their experiences and their fears of this virus.
Okay.
So I wanted to show that and invite you to kind of consider what it would feel like to be in that situation. So what should be done? These are some recommendations from the Amnesty report. And these are their quotations from public health, a public health expert, Dr. Mark Stern, and from a former senior ICE official, right? And they mentioned some important points. ICE already has the legal authority to release any detained people in its custody for urgent humanitarian reasons or a significant public benefit. So this is well within the scope of what ICE can decide to do. And at the very least, in people who are detained who have serious medical conditions that put them at special risk should definitely be released from detention, right? And there's ample room within the law for ICE to make these choices immediately. And that is acknowledged indeed by this former senior ICE official who says, from a public health perspective, there is no reason to keep them there when ICE has a whole host of alternative to detention programs run by the same actors who can still track people. Why subject guards to this? Why subject food workers to this when alternatives to detention exist to ensure immigration compliance and don't rival public health guidelines? So here's a slide with a few of the resources and websites. I'll certainly make these available in the materials that are provided after the teach-in. Little grain of salt, I think you should take the ICE website because it's definitely true that they're not being entirely forthcoming about the level of the threat in the detention centers. And then what can we do about those other broader issues? Just the fact that the immigrant community more broadly faces a lot of obstacles and is cut off from a lot of sources of aid. I mean, I think the main thing is just to pay attention, to stay attentive to changing policies around COVID-19 and immigration, because it is important, right? 14 to 16% of the population of the country are foreign-born people. They are our neighbors, our family members, our friends, and us ourselves. We are an immigrant nation. So pay attention to that. And then support state and local level inclusion of all residents in relief programs without regard to immigration status. This is really important, and it's important that those messages be sent loudly to the community. Here's an example just from yesterday from the Hill of a Chicago local decision, right, to ensure that immigrants and refugees without regard to immigration status have access to the kinds of economic relief offered. You can support local community services and programs that are inclusive or intentionally reaching out to immigrants. If you're in the Miami Valley or Dayton, here are some places you can contact. Write to daytonimmigration@gmail.com to see how you can help, or call 937-877-5651. A few more news articles, again, that I'll make available about not only the things that the sort of risks that immigrants are facing, but also about the at least 5 hunger strikes that immigrants have declared in resistance, and their demands that ICE provide them with soap and provide enough physical space that they can keep themselves 6 feet distance from one another, and especially that they provide clear and truthful information about whether or not there's an outbreak in their facility. So I'll leave it at that, and I will leave you with this image. Perhaps I can leave it up during the Q&A. This was projected onto the side of the JFK Federal Building on March 22nd by the group Never Again Action that many of you may have heard of. And it reminds us that there are collateral consequences. There's death that comes from harsh and exclusionary immigration enforcement, and that we should heed the lessons of the past here. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate being asked to share my thoughts here.
Thanks so much, Miranda. Fascinating, excellent presentation. We have asked everybody to let us know if they have questions. They can inform Kelly Johnson. In the meantime, I thought I'd ask a question just to begin the conversation. Mm-hmm. A lot of your focus is on release from detention and ensuring safety in COVID-19, but so that is, not particularly an aggressive use of policy. But many human rights experts are quite concerned about the cover that the COVID-19 pandemic gives to governments to be able to more aggressively reach their policy ends around migrants, refugees, or other like opposition figures, for example, in other countries. Are you seeing signs that, in fact, this is enabling forms of enforcement and enabling sort of more aggressive policies, mm-hmm. Besides just stopping processes or not allowing, enabling people to leave highly unsafe detention facilities?
Right. So it is hard to know what's happening at the border right now. There's so much less reporting on that now that the reporting is completely dominated by coronavirus. So it's hard to know, and but there's no doubt that the perception that immigration restrictions are an important part of combating coronavirus has provided an excellent excuse to many administrations that already had as their goal to shut down their obligation to take in refugees, or to process asylum seekers and give them a fair hearing in immigration court. So just in the United States, it is very clear that the Trump administration took not only immigration and immigration restriction as a signature issue, but specifically limiting, constraining, and even eliminating completely the right to asylum as one of their key goals. And they've taken, innumerable steps, dozens of tiny steps towards that, through various mechanisms that I've been following over these last 3+ years. And then now they have been able to just suddenly say, okay, nope, we're not going to process that at all anymore, right? So it's enabled something that would have been very difficult under other circumstances, would have immediately been met with legal challenges that would have been upheld by the courts. But this idea of a state of emergency, it definitely sort of, it gives governments a lot more leeway to act outside the law themselves, to violate laws like the Refugee Act of 1980 in US law, and like the Refugee Convention that has clearly laid out for decades that this is an obligation that the country has, right, to give refuge to people who are displaced.
Great. Thanks so much, Miranda. Again, we'll make Miranda's materials available to everyone, and we're going to pause here, let everybody stretch while we key up our next speaker, who should be speaking to the relevant issues around emergency declarations and other civil and political rights. As Miranda was discussing, the right to claim refugee status is a very clear human right in international norms. Thanks again, Miranda.
Thank you.
Hey, welcome back, everyone. We're going to begin again, and we're very excited to welcome Dr. Joel Pruess, who is a professor of political science. And he's going to be speaking, as I mentioned, about the pandemic and the impact on broader civil and political rights. Joel, I see you've shared your screen. Over to you.
Thanks very much. Can everybody hear me all right? Shall you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you to Shelley Inglis and the Human Rights Center, and thank you to Kelly Johnson and her chair. Okay, got that warning. For hosting this series of teachings and for inviting me today to speak on the following topic, the impact on civil and political rights. Okay, so here's where we want to start. Is civil and political rights are concepts firmly anchored in international law, in particular in a covenant called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was adopted in open for signature in 1966 and entered into force in 1976, which is to say there was a quorum of governments around the world that decided this was a good idea. And in 1976, again, it entered into force. And to this day, there was 172 countries that have ratified it, of a total of about 193. And that's a very high rate of ratification. Human rights treaties generally have very high rates of ratification, and the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as I'll refer to it, is certainly a like a bedrock text in international human rights law. When we talk about civil and political rights, those are very specific categories. I think it's important to understand them as rights associated with life as a citizen and in a political society. And in particular, if we were to look to the text of the law, we see rights that protect an individual's physical integrity, that is the body. So there we're thinking about torture, detention, slavery, freedom of movement, things like that, and democratic participation, the right to participate in one's own government. Among many others. Civil and political rights are not things like rights to health, water, education, housing, or labor. And the acronym at the end of that slide is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And this category and these kinds of topics are largely the basis for the third installment in the teaching series next week, all of which looks really great. So be sure to tune in for that as well. And because both Professor Hallett before me and Professor Hurley after me are focusing on issues around detention, either immigrant or criminal justice detention, I'm going to leave out those areas for the sake of my presentation. And here's sort of the understanding I want to communicate, or at least offer, about the role that human rights can play, well now, but maybe always, which is that human rights are considered as standards. They're a kind of baseline and a framework for analysis and for thinking about politics and power, dignity, and the relationship between individuals and their governments, right? And so when we say standards, we mean, look, like as I suggested, 172 countries, very diverse group of countries, said, look, I want my country to be obligated to these sets of international norms, right? That speaks to a kind of consensus that it can be identified internationally around the rights contained in this particular covenant, right? So they're not specific to the United States. The United States is has ratified the ICCPR. It is one of only 3 human rights treaties that the U.S. has ratified, and so those apply here as well as in many other places. They're a baseline. You know, human rights really very often stipulate minimum conditions of treatment, right? Minimum definitions of dignity, not maximal definitions, and a framework for analysis, which is to say, yes, in a sort of a strict, both conceptual and legal sense, human rights are relationships, are contractual relationships between individuals and their governments. Yeah, but they are also other things, right? They also help us understand and analyze relationships, power, and politics, as I suggested as well. And I think that some of the lessons we can draw from the whatever the understandings that human rights bring to a conversation like this can be applied in sort of non-literal ways, right? So it's not just about whether or not a government violates the rights of its citizen, but how can we learn other things about, again, power, politics, democracy, governance, dignity, humanity, decency, sort of justice, equity, things like that. So we'll shift here to sort of some focus with which Professor Hallett very adeptly and conveniently left off in her last session. The way in which human rights take on a specific kind of focus during public or civil emergencies. Now, for the first thing to note is that there is a general tension between individual rights and common welfare. Human rights are rights of individuals, right? Yet individuals live in societies and communities and states and in fact worlds wherein we have to coexist with others who have different values than us, others who have different feelings and perspectives than us. And so there's a fraught tension between individual rights and common welfare, as well as individual rights internally, right? So, you know, a sort of a classic case in the U.S. constitutional sense, you know, you don't have a right to scream fire in a crowded theater. Does that violate my freedom of speech? Yes. However, in this particular incident, the rights of others to be safe trumped my individual right to freedom of speech. So there are all sorts of internal tensions here that are not paradoxes. They're not circular. They're not redundant. They just sort of take some wrestling, and not only wrestling, they get worked out in policy and in culture and in other venues. So this tension is sort of not unique to emergencies, but certainly they are heightened. And you know, frankly, in most of our lifetimes, depending on how young the youngest among us are, you know, clearly the post 9/11 context is a touchstone for how human rights will fare in the context of a public emergency, right? And so, how many sort of, not only in terms of practice and legal interpretation on behalf of the government, but even on the side of public opinion. Torture was very popular after 9/11. Right, torture as an interrogation technique to help sort of save lives. The quote ticking time bomb scenario is torture, justifiable, despite the fact being patently illegal under international law. There, in fact, is not only prohibited in the ICCPR, but it's also prohibited in a standalone treaty all of its own, the Convention Against Torture. But in a time of this heightened insecurity, heightened uncertainty, this concern with threat, particularly an invisible threat, right? I mean, I think that there are a lot of parallels to draw from, you know, the way that both the government and the public responded to the post 9/11 war on terror, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll look to some of those as guidances. Now, in the ICCPR, this is text from the covenant itself. If we do share the presentations, those links below are hyperlinked, but I'm not going to, the text below is hyperlinked, I'm not going to use them, the links right now. But even in the ICCPR, in the body of it, they recognize the fact that, look, public emergencies will happen, right? And human rights, whereas we do think of them as both basic, fundamental, but also trumps, right? That should really carry the day when confronted with other kinds of challenges. There will become times when, for instance, in the time of public emergency, which threatens the life of the nation and the existence of which is officially proclaimed, that is the existence of the threat, state parties to the covenant, those that have signed it, may take measures derogating from their obligations under the present covenant to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation. So derogation is sort of this legal term that says, I'm going to publicly declare that we are exempt from following this particular law. In the second clause of Article 4, articles within the convention, 6, 7, 8, etc., are not permissive. You know, derogation is not permissive for the concepts, as I've indicated here in brackets: the right to life, prevention of torture, prohibition on torture, slavery, due process, the right to thought, conscience, and religion. And third, and I think this is super important from an international legal perspective, any state to the present covenant availing itself of the right of derogation, that right to be exempt, shall immediately inform the other state parties, and a further communication shall be made through the same intermediary on the date of which it terminates such derogation, right? So in the body of the law itself, it states that, look, there might come a time when governments who have obligated themselves to fulfill this treaty need to exempt themselves. There are certain things you can't exempt, right? However, if you decide to do, you have to make it public. You have to tell all the other countries who've ratified this treaty. You have to say how long it's going to last, right? And in fact, if you examine this, and in fact, the link below, when it was, you know, in a general comment in 2001, the Human Rights Committee, which monitors the ICCPR, has a longer extrapolation of really what this means. And I'm sure there's nothing to this. It was adopted like 2 weeks maybe before 9/11, which is so unusual. But yeah, it says all sorts of things. You have to come to the international community. You have to make some public statements. You have to do reporting. I mean, all of these kinds of relationships, again, are very bedrock to the way the international human rights system works. there are these sort of monitoring and reporting processes by which governments have, oh, okay, that's for everybody. Good, thanks. Governments have these processes they should comply with in an effort to expand transparency, right? That look, we recognize these things may occur, you're a sovereign country, yet there still should be some checks on how these kinds of public emergencies are utilized, how certain violations of rights are justified. It keeps blinking, I don't know what to do with it, but that's my fault. 5 minutes, thanks Laura, okay, that was quick. So here I want to think about these in 3 axes. 1 is the respect for rights in crisis response. 2 is concern for violations in the name of crisis response. And 3 is the concern for temporary policy made permanent, right? So, in the bold in the middle, there are crises are become exploitable moments in which we tolerate intolerable behavior, for instance, like torture after 9/11. And, this is sort of a broader social comment, but as we've all, even in our personal and social lives, adapted to these new circumstances, stay at home, all this stuff, right? Work from home, homeschooling, all this stuff. I really think we have to at least guess at what things won't elastically sort of snap back to normal, right? We talk about a new normal. I don't really know what that is, but the point is that there are things that are changing now that won't go back, right? So if movie theaters go out of business and they're not bailed out and we get used to watching all of our movies at home, maybe that's that pre-crisis sort of element of our life that won't snap back into place, right? And I highly doubt we will stop hugging each other. However, I really do think how this prolonged period of social distancing might impact the way we think about how we touch each other, how we breathe, the space that we inhabit together. And maybe I'm paranoid, and I am paranoid, and I'm all these other things. But that's sort of the point: is that rights violations that are made in the interest of this public emergency, in the common welfare during the pandemic, how these things, might become permanent, I think is really essential for us to consider now for the purpose of being vigilant, right? For the purpose of noticing them, not shirking them, not letting them slide. And these kinds of things have already been recognized by a panel of UN experts. I'm not going to read this verbatim, except that the highlighted text: emergency responses must be proportionate, necessary, and non-discriminatory. To prevent such excessive powers to become hardwired, right, not permanent, restrictions should be narrowly tailored and be the least intrusive means to protect public health, right? Think about the way those are qualified. It's super important. Human Rights Watch says something very similar. You can limit people's rights and freedoms, but they must be lawful, necessary, and proportionate, limited in duration, take into consideration disproportionate impact, okay? So this is exactly, I think, the kind of way that we need to be thinking about. And these are some of the topics, and I'll sort of throw these out, and I will respect the time, at least most of it, and then we can speak about them. The first is the right to life, right? And the right to life is interpreted really not with respect to the unborn, but really about how a government treats people before they die, right? You don't only have a right to life when you die. You have 3 minutes. Got it? There are all these things the government has to do to prevent you from dying, right? The right to be free from discrimination. So we're already aware, and I know Professor Lawrence Sanders made this clear last week too, that there is disparate impact on, for instance, African-American communities so far. So how must the response also be disparate? That is to say, accommodate those that are disproportionately impacted, right? Freedom of movement. Yes, we're all locked down in the United States, but obviously in China, there was a much, and even in Italy, a much more militarized version of what it means to keep people in their homes. In certain cities in the US, they're passing out fines. And again, connecting back to discrimination, what neighborhoods are being policed, right? What is the racial or ethnic breakdown of who's getting those tickets and how it's being policed, right? So freedom of movement, we might tolerate the idea that the government is, again, in the United States, suggesting strongly that we stay home. Not a denial of rights, but who knows where things could go or how people could act out in different ways. So freedom of movement, right to privacy. Now, in certain other countries, this is already being explored. Presumably, it's being used here too. But the government access to, for instance, things like your phone tracking, GPS systems, so they're able to locate how a person who is infected moves around and might, sort of through contact tracing, infect other people. Whether or not they have the right to have access to knowledge, to the data about your movement, may or may not be an invasion of your privacy. Same on the side of health data, right? Big data around health, whether that's coming from your medical healthcare provider or your Fitbit, right? I mean, there's a lot of sources of this health data, and what entities have access to it, and how legal or authorized it is might be a compromise of your right to privacy. Freedom of expression and right to receive information. Here we're thinking about things like journalists and scientists that become really important during times of public emergency. And the last two that are heightened, that are bolded, are the what ifs. And I don't mean, again, this is my paranoid self, and I prefer to be wrong. But if something, God forbid, really bad happens somewhere and a community wants to respond in public, and maybe it's after things have subsided, how might this crisis be exploited by the government to prevent protests, to prohibit assembly, and against who, right? And what kinds of communities are the targets of these exploitations? So, how long this goes on for, and how it becomes sort of utilized by the government in the future, right? In a period of time when maybe it is not as essential if it is right now, I think is essential consideration. And finally, there's an election coming up, and obviously there's already been questions about whether or not and how to hold primaries. Can we do it by mail? Can we not? And if the federal government were to say we are postponing the November election, the general election, that would be a very, very, very significant infringement, and something that we should be vigilant about now. I'm sure the ACLU already has their briefs ready to go just in case, because they're ready. And I know I'm over time, but here's the things that I think the pandemic exposes with respect to human rights violations, the underlying structural problems, for instance, around disparate impact, the fragility of law and norms, how quickly things can change. The things that we rely on and things that we've come to expect are permanent and for all time. Concentration of power, what the government or technological or the private, concentration of power in the private sector, whether it's around who holds a ventilator, who doesn't, who has access to those things, trust in government, what we need government for, and what it is willing and or able and competent to do. Certainty of uncertainty, I don't really know what that means, but it sounded good at the time. I'm looking forward to talking with you over the next 10 or so minutes. Again, thank you for the invitation.
Thanks so much, Joel. That's fantastic. A lot of ground covered there in a short period of time. And Miranda already has a question. I had a question prepared, but I will cede my place to Miranda. Over to you, Miranda.
Thank you. Thanks, Joel. It was really interesting. And you focused on kind of principles that might not snap back. I'd like to ask you kind of a similar question, but from a different angle. What are the troubling political trends in particular that you've seen kind of maybe recently that have been amping up over the last couple decades that seem likely to be affixed or driven deeper by this crisis? I'm thinking here, like a couple examples might be surveillance and the arbitrary detention and incarceration, restrictions on mobility, right? Those have all been upward trending. And so those just being two examples, you could come up with another one, but which political trend do you most fear going into hyperdrive under this pandemic?
Yeah, surveillance is a really big one for me, and I'll say something about that. And the other is the concentration of executive power. So on the surveillance, I mean, this is, a sort of private sector with public sector support and use over the course of time, has sort of developed in this infrastructure, this architecture of surveillance, this technological surveillance, whether it's in terms of data or hardware and software, is something that is sort of widely in place and just ready and ripe for abuse, and it's already sort of being abused. And again, these all sound horrible, and probably they're already in use, right? So the one, and this intersects with things that you were talking about too. I think this is correct. You'll forgive me. I've had limited time to actually read anything, but I've read a lot of headlines. Like New York public schools stopped using Zoom for their classrooms because there was a concern that the feeds were the video was getting shared with law enforcement, in particular immigration enforcement, and how facial recognition technology could use this enormous pool of data, because millions of people are using it now, to then target communities for whatever, right? For deportation or otherwise. So that, I think, if you have a question, that's Kelly too. Okay. So that is something that, that data tracking, whether it's sort of Zoom or anything else, is really frightening to me, because again, that's very much an infrastructure and architecture in waiting to be abused and exploited, in particular by the government. And the other one is the concentration of executive power. I mean, and this has been true for the last 3 years, but it's true throughout Obama too. And a lot of it's post 9/11. This sort of trust that I don't know who we is, the trust that I'll just use me, that the trust that I've had in executives to sort of do things without checks, and the faith that I've had in sort of law, norms, and institutions, right? And so that's been exploited a lot over the last 3 years. When you think of different things, you're like, oh, I thought a thing like that was not possible or against the rules, or at least against etiquette, right? Now, when someone who doesn't care for etiquette or the rules comes into power and realizes, oh, there's actually no firewalls here. There's actually no great hard institutional, legal, otherwise enforcement mechanisms to prevent me from doing X, right? Or if they are, they won't be used. But, so the concentration of executive power is something that concerns me a great deal, and I do wonder how there might be things we surrender to the government in an effort to empower them to respond effectively to this health crisis that don't snap back or that are exploited for some spin-off crisis or XYZ. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Joel. That is far-reaching in terms of the implications. I wonder if you could switch it, though, and also speak to whether this pandemic is demonstrating opportunities, I hate to use that word, overused, but entry points for the human rights community to strengthen some of the ways to enforce and monitor and secure human rights, and whether there are spaces for conversations that we otherwise would not have had because we couldn't have imagined that we would have a partisan fight over going to an election, even if it's not the main election, it's a primary election during a pandemic, and the risks that would pose to our fundamental rights. Are those conversations opening up spaces that might be used or utilized?
I appreciate your gesture of optimism, or your offer for me to suggest some optimism. I don't know. I don't see it yet. I really don't. Again, even on sort of a non-civil political rights dimension, it's like, does this demonstrate to any majority of people or even any significant subsection of people, Americans, let's say, or any other government, that access to healthcare as a right is like really important, right? And the fact that we don't have it might have enabled the spread of of this disease and killed many more people than otherwise maybe wouldn't have. I would like to wish that was the case, but I don't really see it yet, right? But again, like anything like this, and I really do want to reiterate, is that any kind of projection, even into the medium term, is, it's fun, but like, I don't think there's much to it, right? We could speculate, but I mean, everything is sort of week to week here, whether it's how many people are going to die, or what the November election is going to look like. I mean, I think that's why, like, again, anchoring back in the sort of framework of human rights from a position of vigilance and awareness, right? It was almost like, I love the word literacy, right? So that you're sort of aware and attuned to the ways in which things shift if you're sort of using that human rights framework. Yeah, I mean, in terms of like reporting and monitoring and enforcement, I mean, this is sort of a bigger question about, is there clearly, at least so far, and maybe this was the right choice, this sort of decision to hole up, right? This decision for every country to stop travel. Now, stop travel doesn't mean withdraw from the international community necessarily. However, given, rising tides of nationalism elsewhere, sort of putting up walls in this era made sense. And we'll have to see sort of, if there is a sort of a return to international cooperation and collaboration. Now, again, if we were I was talking about global governance in my international law class 2 months ago, and it's something like a pandemic is a textbook case of when international cooperation is essential, right? Because we can't all do it on its own. What would they say? Problems without borders or something. Well, no, problems without passports. That's what it is, right? A disease can come and go. It doesn't have to check in at customs. As of naturally, you need some transnational or international cooperation to put together an effective response. That has not been the case. It has not hardly even been the case at the federal level by the federal government, right? You see Gavin Newsom, trying to put other states, other United States together to try to form a consortium to control part of the market around ventilators and masks. I like it is crazy, right? So there's this real turn inward, and I don't think the federal government has really helped here. And so, yeah, is there a moment? Is there going to be a moment? Is there going to be a tide when things start to look a different way, where we understand our international obligations and understand not only that that it might be good, but that it's useful, right? The utility of international obligations, whether it's around rights or other forms of consensus or cooperation. Maybe, maybe. And maybe when we all have a chance to breathe, there'll be some of that space, but I have a hard time locating it yet.
Thanks, Joel. Kelly Johnson actually had one quick question, which maybe you can speak to in terms of actual human rights advocates and what they're doing right now around enforcement and defense in light of social distancing, and what kind of trends you're seeing in terms of what human rights activists need to be doing.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and this is to Miranda's point too, like there have been actions, maybe others have seen this, right, of people showing up outside of detention centers, whether it's immigration or criminal justice, in cars, honking, doing things like that, banners, walkouts. I mean, certainly you see, and I always give a shout out, but the IUECWA, nationally headquartered in Dayton, Ohio, they have a range of actions going on today at GE factories across the country. People are walking off the job to say we need to be safe at work, right? And we want to sort of promote the public health good. We want to be able to contribute by making ventilators instead of cars, or instead of other kinds of appliances, let's say. So there's a lot of stuff going on the labor side for sure, right? Whether it's Amazon, Instacart, manufacturing sectors, people really taking things into their own hands very, very boldly. There are also processes going on at the UN, right? So I was on a call, the Universal Periodic Review is this process the United States government is sort of a monitoring process the US government was supposed to sit for in May, where they go before the international community and atone for their sins, or at least have some sort of a transparent accounting of their record, their human rights record. That's been postponed, but there are processes that are still underway, and they're heightened and magnified in this sort of way. They say, okay, this stuff, it's okay. Hi, everybody. They're shifting in this way. It's like all the things, the problems that we used to have are still there, and some of them are much more heightened, much more complicated. And so all those things sort of continue. And what was virtual or transnational still is, it's just online. And the other thing, and maybe this is more to your optimism, is that these are moments for creativity, right? These are moments for real deep, creative, innovative thinking about how we do our work, not only given new obstacles, but given whatever uncertain future we're all going to encounter soon.
Great. Thank you, Joel. We're going to end it there and give a few moments for the next speaker to be able to prepare. We really appreciate your intervention. Be back in 1 minute with our next speaker.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Can you hear me okay?
So welcome back, everyone. Thanks to Martha Hurley, who is a professor and director of Criminal Justice Studies program at the university. We're now going to pivot, although very connected to both Professor Preuss's and Professor Hallett's presentations on the impact of COVID-19 in relation to the criminal justice system, and particularly for those who are incarcerated. Over to you, Martha.
Great. I'd like to just begin by saying thank you to the Human Rights Center and to the Feree Chair of Social Justice for inviting me to participate as part of the virtual teach-in about the pandemic and the common good. I really think we need to have far more of these conversations, especially with regard to vulnerable populations, than we've been having recently. We are all being impacted by COVID-19 in a variety of ways, and it's certainly catastrophic economically in terms of the impact on employment, education, the loss of our ability to make certain decisions, such as where to go and with whom we can spend our time. And those issues, when you think about how stressful that is for us, those issues are magnified when we start talking about incarcerated populations. And I think there's a lot that remains to be done. It's only in the last 10 days or so where we've seen an increase in the number of reports about the impact of COVID-19 on incarcerated populations. And the safety and well-being of incarcerated individuals is just as important for us to think about as it is the safety and well-being of non-institutionalized populations. And so I've sort of arranged this talk more as a conversation where I'll start with a visual depiction of where we are with regard to COVID-19 in prisons in the US, and then talk a little bit about the intersectionality between what we have identified as the most vulnerable individuals in the non-institution, and what does that mean when we switch our lens to thinking about incarcerated persons and the impact of COVID-19, and then review a little bit of what's out there now or what's happening policy-wise with regard to responses to COVID-19 at political levels and at the local levels. There are so many issues that I really don't have time to talk about all of the issues related to staff who work in institutions and the families of incarcerated individuals. So recognize at the outset that I'm keeping my comments fairly brief. But let me start with a depiction of what we know currently, an interactive map that at the end of this presentation, but if we just look at the US here, this is a map of COVID-19 cases behind bars. And when I first came across this map a few weeks ago, I didn't see anywhere near as many pins on the map. And just so you are aware, the blue pins on the map represent cases in institutions in the US where individuals may be experiencing symptoms but not necessarily tested positive. As you look at the burgundy colored pins on this map, those are deaths in institutions. And this map, quite honestly, likely undercounts the true number of cases in institutional settings here in the US. Because as you may or may not be aware, we get most of our information, the best information, from people who are actually incarcerated. And we don't always know what's really happening in institutions. And there is very clear evidence now that institutions are not necessarily reporting all of the cases that are happening. This map is a composition of news reports about cases in institutions and information about symptoms and impact from inside sources in institutions. And so there are more than 300 institutions currently who have either inmates with symptoms that are of flu-like symptoms, respiratory symptoms. A smaller number have actually tested positive. And so we are looking at a major problem. Just a couple of days ago, Stateville Penitentiary in Joliet, Illinois, reported a significant number of inmates hospitalized in the local hospital facility, and likely hundreds of more inmates who might have symptoms but have never been tested. So we know a lot about the pandemic in terms of non-institutionalized populations, but what's happening behind bars is a bit more intense. And I'll go back here. So what are we dealing with in terms of the impact of COVID-19? I think we should start with a conversation about the fact that at the outset, we know a lot about who's most vulnerable to coronavirus in non-institutionalized populations. We've heard a lot about people who are older, people with asthma, people with HIV and other immunocompromised diseases, people with diabetes, liver and kidney conditions, people with obesity issues. I think it's a body mass index of 40 or higher. We also, based on the CDC's website, have some idea of those individuals who are non-institutionalized who should really be taking more precautions, such as pregnant mothers, people with disabilities, which you heard a little bit about in an earlier presentation, people who have difficulty understanding information, people who might struggle to communicate. And we also have some indication from the CDC of a growing interest in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on the homeless, which I think Dr. Reed will be talking about next. And we've identified for non-institutionalized populations ways to flatten the curve. Social distancing, self-isolation, and quarantining are the things that we are all dealing with. But what does this mean for justice-involved populations? I would argue that incarcerated persons are more vulnerable to these conditions and the complications associated with COVID-19. And prisons are not designed for social distancing. It's hard to social distance when you are sharing a cell with someone. It's hard to take a step back and receive adequate medical care. Correctional systems have been sued over inadequate medical care. And so when you think about the impact of COVID-19 on the jail population and the prison population, we're also not talking about a small number of people. We as individuals can social distance, self-isolate at home. They can't do that in the prison. And we're talking about in jails, more than 600,000 individuals, most of whom have not been convicted or sentenced of a crime. When we talk about state prison populations who might be impacted, we're talking about 1.29 million people, more than 200,000 people in federal jails, and 4 million people who are on probation and parole. All of these groups are not only vulnerable in terms of their connections to the justice system, but also often have or experience significant health-related complications that fall into the vulnerable category outside of prison walls, outside of jail walls. For example, 50% of prisoners and jail inmates have had chronic medical conditions in the past, and 40% of those people who are housed currently state that they have some sort of chronic medical condition. And what are those conditions? According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, what you find are high rates of cancer, high blood pressure, stroke-related problems, diabetes, heart-related problems, kidney problems, asthma, cirrhosis of the liver, all of those things that the CDC website very clearly indicates pose increased risks outside prison walls. We ought to be thinking about what it means for those who are incarcerated in the prison or local jails. We talked about disabilities in the earlier session. Half of prisoners held in jail have a mental health condition, and 25% of those individuals have a severe mental health condition. Add to that addiction, and again, you start to see that the coronavirus is likely to have an even greater impact on those people who are incarcerated. And I'll read this quote from Governor DeWine yesterday, who said, "Prisons pose a unique challenge in this pandemic. Social distancing in the general population, as you know, is helping us flatten the curve. But when we're dealing with prison inmates, corrections officers, it's a different situation. Social distancing becomes obviously more challenging." Why? Because of the very nature of our institution. Incarcerated individuals live in what are considered total institutions. They live, work, eat, study, do everything together in a congregate manner, which are all those things that we are encouraged now not to do. We've been basically restricted from getting together in large groups or even small groups. Jails also have very high turnover. And at the local level, what this means is that people are being released and people are coming in on a very regular basis, again, increasing the possibility of exposure. And some jails are overcrowded. And so what you also find, and I thought this was kind of interesting on the CDC, which they just put out a guidelines for correctional facilities on March 23rd. In the guidelines, they suggest that incarcerated persons be given hand sanitizer. Well, most of our facilities do not grant inmates, incarcerated persons, access to hand sanitizer because of the alcohol content. There's limitations in terms of access to toilet paper and tissue and soap, the very things that we've been told we ought to be doing more of. Inmates incarcerated in jails and prisons are restricted of from obtaining or accessing. And so what this means ultimately is that we should expect the impact of COVID-19 to be much greater in institutional settings, and that's now starting to bear out. We've seen a variety of justice responses. Some law enforcement agencies report that police officers now are less likely to stop people, more likely to issue citations because they don't want to come into contact with individuals who might have been exposed. An interesting policy shift that's taking place in conversations that are happening around the country is a push to reduce the number of individuals who are in fact held in local jails and prisons. So we are seeing some states be proactive. And again, DeWine yesterday talked about releasing certain inmates in Ohio early because of this sort of environment that breeds the transfer of communicable illnesses in institutional settings. And while I think this is a great trend that we should have been having these conversations about reducing the jail population a lot sooner. And now, again, we've got a situation where, as you saw in that map I put up initially, the numbers of individuals who are incarcerated testing positive for COVID-19 or showing symptoms is on the rise, and it's impacting the community because they have to bring those individuals out of the institution and into local hospitals. There's a lack of quarantine facilities in jails and prisons that prove challenging. And there was a Huffington Post article this week that sort of identifies, again, the complications here. And I know I need to finish up. As part of the movement to release people early from jail, some of these individuals don't have a place to go. And in the Huffington Post article, it was an aunt of someone that they had decided to release early from jail. And the aunt is talking about concerns about bringing that person into their home, or the fact that a lot of these folks ultimately end up homeless and in the streets. So I think all of these issues that we're talking about today are certainly connected, and we have barely scraped the surface in terms of the impact of COVID-19 on incarcerated persons who are more at risk, who have greater health concerns, and release may or may not be the best option. We should have been releasing people and paying attention to this vulnerable population earlier. And I'll just end with this. What do we do now? There's a lot of advocacy happening with groups around the country advocating for the early release of the nonviolent individuals from local jails, paroling the elderly from institutions. And we are seeing some movement. I don't have time to put the slide up now, but even in the state of Ohio, we are seeing jail populations in Cuyahoga and Hamilton County decreased because there is a push to move these individuals out of the jail setting. It's my hope that early release and bail reform won't be limited to the COVID-19 situation, but will raise broader questions about how we operate in terms of incarceration in the US, and how do we reduce that population. And so I will end there and take questions, I guess.
Thank you so much, Martha. And if you have more slides, again, we're happy to get them displayed so people can access them. And great to see so many resources. It's a very interesting conversation around this population. And we do have questions already, so I'll hand it over to Alex to ask his question.
After the Lisbon contraband video, where the prisoners used a contraband phone to release the video to the public, saying it was much, much worse than prisons were reporting, people were dying all over the prison. How worried are you that Ohio situation is worse than we think it is? And I mean, we have a horrible track record of prison conditions anyway, especially in Cuyahoga County. So how worried are you about Ohio?
I'm worried about every state, and Ohio is not immune. I mean, we have 49,000, I think, incarcerated persons, and we're releasing 140. I mean, we know that there is an age crime curve, that people age out, and that there are people who are currently incarcerated in Ohio who are not as likely to commit crime again. And just by the fact that we are holding them in institutional settings when they are essentially low risk, suggests that potential for harm in terms of health and well-being. Again, they can't self-isolate. Most people are double bunked or sleeping in dormitory style settings. And so again, I would be very worried. It's my hope that we would see some movement in Ohio on bail reform, as some of the states now are really taking a serious look and getting people out of jail. And we're seeing more states as well reducing greater numbers of incarcerated persons from prison. So it's a legitimate concern.
So Martha, there are certainly categories, as you were indicating, of prisoners who are more likely or could be more likely for release. Those who are in pretrial detention, for example, those who are elderly, Has there been some systematic work being done around advocacy to categorize the nature of those who would be most appropriate for an early release? And has there been work done around organizing the services that obviously are needed to be put in place, as you mentioned, not only related to housing, but other forms of support, social and economic, that released prisoners would need? Have you seen any systematic work coming out around ensuring increasing services for those who are being released?
We have not, at least nationally, it seems that every state's doing its own thing. So once again, where you are incarcerated impacts your likelihood of being released early, and the services are not necessarily there. We have, for example, I think it's California. They are putting people up in hotels, the homeless, as well as people released from prison. And there's not a lot of conversation about what services those individuals are receiving. It's not clear, even with the governor's response yesterday about releasing these nonviolent folks who would have been released within 90 days, what happens to those individuals? And the reason I say that is because probation and parole has also changed as a result of COVID-19. We are seeing probation and parole officers not wanting to make home visits. So we're seeing fewer individuals coming out under supervision. We've got an overburdened agency system that is itself being hit by COVID-19. And so these are real challenges, Shelley. And in my read, every state seems to be doing something a little bit different, or coming into the notion of early release without thinking about reentry.
I think we have another question from Lori.
Hi, Dr. Hurley. Before we had a conversation in our offices up in St. Joe's maybe a month ago now regarding some prison funding initiatives that are on ballots that would have been voted on, obviously in the recent election, had it not been, well, and they're still on the ballot, I assume, for the April 28 election. So for example, here in Greene County, we've got, money for a new jail on the ballot. Like we weren't even thinking of all working from home and this being right at our back door at the time that, you and Kelly and I had this conversation. How do those issues around the size of jails, the conditions of jails, the number of extra beds that you need to have in a jail at any particular time sort of intersect with this situation that we have now, where we need to have more space between our inmates just because of this particular pandemic, and we can't do it because of the crowding situations?
There are a couple of things that I'll respond in with regard to this, Lori. First and foremost, I was looking at some data for Ohio earlier in the week, and the larger counties are reducing their jail population. So I do think it would, in my opinion, be sort of foolish to vote to expand the jail when we are releasing at the numbers that we're starting to see. What would be more beneficial is opening up the conversation about reentry and programs in the community versus expansion. I mean, if we will release early for the coronavirus, this is a perfect time for a natural experiment in terms of what is happening with regard to the crime rate. And I think jail expansion shouldn't be a part of the conversation at this moment in time when people have such extreme medical needs. There are also stories coming out about the lack of supplies for people who work in jails and prisons, in terms of, they're experiencing the same problems in terms of gloves and masks and access. And we know that jails and prisons are often not well ventilated. So expansion, in my opinion, I think we won't see and shouldn't see a continuation of those types of conversations.
Thanks.
Martha, we had a presentation in our first series around the disparate impact of COVID-19 that's emerging on the African American population. There's also disparate impacts around gendered dimensions of the pandemic. Have you seen any of this playing out? And of course, obviously, we have a disproportionate amount of African Americans detained in this country due to racial injustice in the criminal justice system. Is there a conversation that is linking some of these trends together?
These conversations are starting. I think today there is a webinar, or tonight, that specifically speaks about COVID-19, the African American community, and incarceration and community based injustices. And I think that's likely to continue. We're likely to see more, because there was an article today online about the number of African Americans who are dying as a result of the coronavirus, and the media portrayals of corona. You see very few individuals in hospitals from minority groups. And so if that's the only source of your information, it's a potential problem, because this is a virus that doesn't discriminate on the basis of race. And if you are talking about a group of individuals who might have additional health problems, and those health problems are magnified in an incarcerated setting, I think that'll be the next shift in terms of where I think the conversation needs to go.
Thanks, Martha. We are going to wrap it up there and allow for a transition to the next speaker. We really appreciate your time. And if you have any closing brief thoughts on the trends globally, if you're seeing any very interesting work around this issue in other countries, or whether the United States and what we're presenting here, obviously we have the largest population of incarcerated people globally, but if this is something that is a struggle for across the globe, I'll let you end with that, and then we'll transition to the next speaker.
I would encourage people to go take a look at the COVID-19 behind bars map. That is a global map. I think that the situation, in fact, is likely worse. This isn't just a US problem. If you are incarcerated at this moment in time, you are, again, talking about globally individuals with greater health-related concerns as a result of addiction and various other things, and a population that in certain countries receives even fewer services than what we see in the US. So I do think it's a global concern. And I think there are advocacy groups, a variety of advocacy groups out there that are now pushing this issue to say we ought to take a global look at what's happening, what has happened behind bars, because the rates for institutionalized populations globally are likely magnified.
Thanks so much, Martha. We're going to pause for a minute and transition to our next speaker.
that you're able to do that?
Surely. Yeah, it seems to work.
Okay, that looks good. Perfect.
Yeah, I was.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just wanted to check.
Well, thank you.
Those who are homeless as one of a key group of vulnerable people in the impact of COVID-19 on this particular part of our society and population. I'd like to welcome Roger Reeb, a professor of psychology, and thank him for his time today. Roger, you're all set up, so over to you.
Thank you. I want to start by expressing a heartfelt appreciation to both Shelley Inglis and Kelly Johnson for inviting me to participate. I've really enjoyed the other presentations today, and something that's exciting is I see a lot of places of possible overlap. My presentation today is going to be just maybe a little different than some. It's going to be focused more on a specific project that's been going on for about 8 years, and how we have needed to make adjustments in order to continue to do meaningful work in the face of this pandemic. The objectives of the presentation are to provide an overview of my project. It's about 8 years old, and it's a collaboration with St. Vincent de Paul of Dayton. It's a participatory community action research project in homeless shelters. To discuss some adjustments in our project and some issues and problems with the homeless community along the way, discuss some adjustments to our project due to the pandemic, and to provide some basic resources and recommendations for mental health as we cope with the COVID-19. So let's go ahead and get started. Brief overview of my project, and then we'll get to the adjustments that we're trying to do. So this project that has a lot to do with what something happening right here in our local setting, and it has a lot to do with what some of our students at UD are doing to continue to try to engage in community engagement, community work, as they're needing to do the social distancing and stay at home and so on. So one feature of my project is that it uses this participatory community action research strategy. All that really means in a nutshell is that you have community partners who are involved in your research from the very beginning throughout the entire project, from the conceptualization, development, implementation, and even the evaluation of the project, and of course, mutual work on funding. Just as a briefly comment on these collaborations, again, the chief collaboration is the one that I have with the administrators at St. Vincent de Paul that go back to about 2010, 2011, and then the project beginning in about 2012. Examples of partnerships that I interface in various ways with here at UD are the Human Rights Center, the Hanley Sustainability Institute, and the Fitz Center for Leadership and Community, and that would include the AmeriCorps project and Dayton Core projects. Examples of campus community projects. My newest one, which I'll talk just a minute about later, is the Ohio State University Extension Program, but we partner with the Homeless Solutions Board, the Montgomery County Office of Reentry, which is really critical because of the high percentage of individuals in the homeless shelter who have a past of incarceration, and also the National Mental Illness, which reaches out and does various sessions in the community and in agencies such as homeless shelters and prisons. And also, as another example, Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous. We view homelessness as a human rights issue. Now, with the understanding that I am trained as a clinical psychologist and a clinical community psychologist, I feel that we do conceptualize our project relating to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, not something that I will be getting into today, but there are some background slides that, in case there are some questions, and certainly the slides relating our project and our teaching techniques to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights will be available. Our project is transdisciplinary, which means probably, as you could tell from the partners that we have, that we pull from various disciplines, because different disciplines can have something important to offer to the project. But transdisciplinary means that you're not only, working across disciplines, but you're also, as you know, working with agencies in the community and bringing them together so that sometimes agencies can be brought together and create a gestalt that doesn't exist if they're operating in isolation. There's a term from community psychology, psychopolitical validity, that really all that means is that a project is said to be psychopolitically valid if you are trying to move beyond Band-Aid like approaches and just pure ameliorative approaches toward more empowerment of people or empowerment of groups, and ultimately attempting to advocate and hopefully even perhaps make some changes in the system or in policy. So we strive to meet the criteria of what researcher named Latinsky in community psychology calls psychopolitical validity. We use service learning pedagogy, which most of you are probably familiar with service learning, but very briefly, it means that students are in a course where they're learning about a topic, and they are also working in an agency where they're doing experiential work that conceptually fits and coincides with the concepts that they're learning in the course. And the two are glued together, if you will, by ongoing reflection, both written and group discussions, which is kind of the glue that pulls the experiential work together with the conceptual, more academic work. So the project I'm talking about would not be possible without my students. So I really almost wish that all of them were here to hear me say this, because this project, as you can see, just is completely impossible without a large group of dedicated students. So briefly, we implement something called behavioral activation in the homeless shelters. Behavioral activation is a strategy, it's a therapeutic strategy, an empowerment strategy of providing individuals with opportunities that they otherwise would not have. And then after they engage in these activities, they experience what the psychologist calls response contingent reinforcement. They feel better about themselves, they feel empowered, and they also have learned something to make themselves more self-sufficient, and this tends to generalize them to other areas of their life. So we do 3 categories of behavioral activation sessions. The one type of session that we do is to enhance empowerment or self-sufficiency. I think that the best example of this might be, or one of the good examples, is that we were able to install computer labs in all of the 2 shelters that we work in, which is the St. Vincent de Paul shelters, the Men's Gateway shelter, as well as the shelter for women and families. Prior to our project, they did not have computers to work on. And there's discussions right now in the literature about whether access to the internet is a human right, because what can you do without access to the internet? I don't believe you can even apply for a job at Walmart or Target or wherever, Subway, whatever, without, if you go in and ask for an application, especially, unfortunately, if you happen to look like a homeless person, you are likely to be shooed out and told it's all online. Another example of empowerment activities is reflected in our collaboration with Judge Rice's reentry program. A good number of folks at the shelter, when they attempt to apply for jobs, there's that black box that they have to deal with. And so we are prepared with our collaboration to be able to set such individuals up to enter the reentry program and thereby get prepared to go out and get jobs, because there are employers who have had these agreements with Judge Rice's reentry program, whereas if they graduate from the program, and it is a big deal, there's a graduation ceremony and everything that Judge Rice speaks at. If they're able to graduate from the program, then these employers will hire them, whereas otherwise they will not. The social stigma is really quite high, unfortunately. We have very strong reason to believe that if somebody applies for many jobs, and if they have to put the homeless shelter down as their residence, that they're automatically disqualified and not considered. So this is a big deal. Much less, a past of incarceration. A second group of activities involves coping, and here's where we run all kinds of different stress management groups. We have the National Alliance on Mental Illness come through and do sessions. We have Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous, and I just learned that there's an internet online-based online ability to do Narcotics Anonymous, which we might be implementing. As this goes on, and the services, we're not able to be there at the shelters to provide services. So we try to enhance individuals' coping because of the high level of stress that at baseline people who are homeless are under. So you can imagine people who at baseline have so much stress in their life that they don't know how they're going to get through the day. And now they have this pandemic to deal with, and some of them are getting sick, and it's a big deal. And then they've even lost services, because we have students through the shelters many hours throughout the week, so they've lost opportunities to get into the computer lab as much, to apply for jobs and do a lot of the work that we do with them. Another group of activities really focuses on enhancing the shelter's social climate. These can be recreational activities, they can be cookouts, and you might be wondering, well, why are these important? Well, they're important because of a rapport that's established between students and the shelter residents. So I'm going to very briefly highlight the benefits of the shelter project. The shelter residents report based on psychometric instruments and also qualitative data, so it's a mixed methods approach, that our sessions are meaningful, important, worthy of repeating, and enjoyable, and that we find that over time, those who engage in our project show this and increase in empowerment and hope, and the other qualities there listed, which I won't go into because again time constraints, and all the PowerPoint presentations will be posted. We also examine studies in students who work at the projects, and we do quasi-experimental studies, and we've had over 300 service learning students work in our project. And over time, we've found that compared to individuals who are not involved in service, students involved in this project and implementing it, showing pre to post semester improvements in community service self-efficacy, decreases in stigma, and awareness of privilege. Something else we're working on right now is doing advocacy assignments and projects in class, and also developing a broad advocacy, self-efficacy for advocacy scale. I'm collaborating with Tony Talbot through the Human Rights Center, who's the director of advocacy, in developing that measure. The newest development is the shelter farm. About 2 to 3 years ago, I collaborated with Ohio State University Agricultural Extension, and we established a farm that's about the size of a soccer field. And for 2 consecutive years, each year, we've harvested almost a ton of produce. And here is some of my students, and I think there's a picture of me in there in a bad hair day, perhaps, but my students and a homeless shelter colleague on the farm. And this has been a big deal, and I've had researchers examine the therapeutic benefits of the shelter residents who volunteer to come out and work on the help with the shelter gardening and farm, as opposed to being in these depressive environments. They're very depressive. I don't think that would surprise you. The men's shelter in particular, is a very much a prison-like setting in its appearance, and some of the buildings around it are still correctional facilities. So these are all of the things that we've done. I mean, if anybody's interested in more of the research component of what we've been able to find, certainly we can discuss offline. But how have we had to shift this? Well, Obviously, we're not able to go into the shelters, so I have regular contact with the shelter administrators and staff managers of the homeless shelters, who I've worked with now for about 10 years. But my service learning students and I have collaborated with the administrators of St. Vincent's de Paul to launch what I hope to be a major fundraising initiative. And so if you're interested in that, please contact me. There are a lot of great needs at the shelter right now, as I think you can imagine. The very needs that are similar to some of the ones that Martha talked about in the prison settings and so forth. We are planning to do Zoom sessions in the behavioral, since we have this whole computer lab, as long as we can maintain social distancing and work with a few people at a time. There are a lot of different things that we could do through Zoom sessions. And there are some staff members there at the shelter who are familiar with the technology enough to work with us on that. And so we could have our Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, social support groups, empowerment groups, even re-entry. Judge Rice's re-entry program, a representative from that program could work with me doing Zoom sessions. There are all kinds of creative initiatives that me, and giving my students a lot of credit for. A lot of my students have come up with creative ideas. Frequently checking in with the shelters. Working to sustain our project as we're coping with this pandemic. There are a lot of the resources that are going to emergencies, and it would be easy for a project like this to kind of fall off the radar screen. So we have to find a way to keep ourselves relevant, to keep ourselves helping during the pandemic, and keep working on funding and so forth, resources in order to keep helping during the pandemic, but also to set the stage so that the project will continue in the future. Maintain our campus community partnerships, which is a big challenge because all of them are so busy dealing with all of the work in their own setting, but not letting those partnerships fall off the radar screen. And I realize I'm going over here, and I'm going to be moving fast, and a lot of this is going to be made available to you. But the development where my students and I have worked hard, and there's even a master's thesis revolving around it, development of a resource advocacy manual for shelter staff to use to assist individuals, to empower them and make them more self-sufficient and decrease the likelihood of them having to come back to the shelter, because the research suggests that in this area, at least approximately 40% of individuals who leave the shelter are back at the very same shelter within a year or less. So having said that, that's hopefully a good segue, talking about a resource manual, into some basic resources that I have here. And again, the PowerPoint presentation will be posted for you. But these are a few of the many resources that my students and I have in the manual that we are sharing with the shelters. But these are basically for emergencies. Most of these services here provided. On to something that may be more helpful to everybody, whether they're in a situation of homelessness or not, is a list of some mental health resources as individuals, be they regular everyday people or individuals are available and pertinent. Across all of these websites, I was able to compile a list, which that I think I've just violated the policy of not having too much on one slide. But then you'll be happy to know that I did then organize the different recommendations from these different sites into some domains, such as stay informed but not preoccupied with the news. There's some reason to believe that individuals who sit and listen to news all day about COVID-19 are becoming much more anxious and stressed, whereas you need to choose your news sources very carefully, and don't confuse what's going on globally with what's happening locally, and monitor your levels of news and intake and social media, just for the sake of your own mental health. Basic ways of coping with stress, accepting that some anxiety and fear is normal, and identifying sources of stress and breaking them down and organizing them, rather than just having an overall overwhelming kind of a feeling of stress. Try to identify the specific sources of stress and cope with them systematically. Also, eliminating baseline stressors that were in your life prior to the pandemic hitting is one way to try to, that maybe some things can be put on the back burner until all of this is over. Remembering that everybody responds differently. Changing what you can and taking control of those situations you can, because uncertainty and lack of control is one of the issues that fuels stress. Accepting what you can't change, and sometimes support is needed for this. And got to be careful with all of those what ifs. What if this? What if that? That can just you got to keep your eye on that kind of thinking. Basic support of others and self. I'm just going to mention a few of these, and again, the slides will be posted. But one that I think is very, very important is staying connected. Please, nobody should confuse social distancing with social disconnection. That a lot of individuals who already have mental health issue problems, be they in everyday life or in a homeless shelter or wherever, if they somehow become disconnected socially, instead of finding some way to stay connected, even if while respecting a social distance, that's going to exacerbate their mental health challenges. And so we have a list of various practical advice here that would be applicable to anybody. Some of it's real common sense, but as you go through the different recommendations, I went through and all of the different sites and kind of found major themes. What I found is that a lot of it was common sense, but then there were some things that I hadn't thought of before, and was glad that I had reviewed all of it. Basic day-to-day scheduling, trying to stay on a schedule and scheduling in breaks, not letting work at home take over your home life. And doing financial planning, but not being preoccupied with financial planning all the time. Working breaks in and taking time to unwind and unplug, and then making time for hobbies. Some people have more difficulty than others separating their work from home, especially now that they're doing their work at home. So I am sorry that I did go over some, but I hope that presentation was somewhat helpful to you in understanding what our project is about, what our students are trying to do. And at this point, I'm open to questions. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thanks so much, Roger. I'm going to field a question to start, and if others have questions, please again inform Kelly Johnson. What are you seeing, or what are you hearing from your partners at the shelter around how the homeless population is being specifically impacted? I know you intimated that a lot of the effects that happen to those who are in institutions, for example, incarcerated in prisons or detention facilities, are similar, but are you hearing about any specific trends around the impact of the pandemic specifically on the homeless population that you work with?
That's a great question, and here's where I really want to take my hat off to and really congratulate the administrators and the staff at St. Vincent de Paul. They've been working night and day, 7 days a week, and they've done some really, really great things. For example, they've been able to identify groups that are most vulnerable, older individuals and also individuals who have immunocompetence problems, and find alternative shelter for them. And sometimes this means, them using funding to rent out Red Roof Inn to try to keep these individuals safer. So it's kind of ironic to think that some individuals end up with better housing now than they had before, just by virtue of the pandemic hitting and them having a health problem or being at risk otherwise. Social distancing, which I think Martha spoke to in the prison settings, is obviously a huge, huge challenge. And they're doing the very best that they can. They do have a big day space at one shelter and a big gymnasium in the other shelter. And as the weather is nice, so they can utilize that to try to have people get some exercise outdoors and practice social distancing. But there are some concerns that it just is not going to be as easy or effective as you and I just agreeing that we're going to stay home, and that the pandemic just hasn't really hit the shelters yet. I've been checking in with the shelters and the degree of the problems, and they have quarantine plans set up. We don't know, and every morning I wake up anxious to find out, is this the day that I find out that the pandemic is hit, and that all of the people, so many people at the shelter have the coronavirus, and they don't know what they're going to do, and that hasn't happened yet. But any day, things like that could change. I was very interested in Joel Pruse's presentation, because the social stigma around homelessness is a major factor at baseline, and a lot of individuals, they're often treated very, very unfairly. And so I do worry to the extent to which those tendencies to violate the rights of individuals who are homeless are going to become exacerbated, and that some of the policies that are put in place now may not be receded, and they may continue to be treated as someone who has leprosy or something, even after the pandemic is settled.
Thanks, Roger. I don't think we have any other questions emerging. We greatly appreciate your presentation, and those are lists of fantastic resources. So we will make sure to make them available to everyone. Very impressive compilation of resources for us to use in the future. And we wish you good luck with your work. We'll take a moment now to pause.
I really appreciate that. And please, if anybody is interested in what I hope will be a huge fundraising effort, please contact me via email, and I would really love to talk to you about what we're doing and why we're doing it and the types of things that are needed. So thanks again.
Okay, we'll pause now as we set up for our next speaker on literature and the pandemic. And thanks again to Roger.
Sorry. How does that look to everybody? Shelly, am I starting?
Hey,
Yes,
Liz,
hi, welcome back. We're very pleased to have Elizabeth or Liz McKay join us. I really appreciate your time, and we are now taking our social justice view of the pandemic into the world of literature and how literature helps us to see the implications of this pandemic throughout history and the contemporary impacts. Over to you, Liz.
Thanks. Everybody can hear me okay? Great. Okay, so yeah, I'm Dr. Mackey, and I just want to thank Shelley and Kelly for the invitation to talk today, and I'm really grateful to those of you who are joining in from home in a hopefully safe and well place. I wanted to talk a little bit about pandemics and historical and fictional literature, and I'm just going to talk about a very small sampling of literature that features pandemics in 4 novels and 1 film. And sort of as just a really general outline, I'm going to talk about what historical fiction has to tell us about during a time of plague or pandemic and surviving and enduring beyond that time. I'm a rhetorician as a trained rhetorician. I'm going to focus on one rhetorical strategy of these fictions, and that is the way in which they personify the pandemic, how a pandemic becomes a major character or a major antagonist in these works. And then finally talk a little bit about what reading these stories and their personifications of disease can teach us about ourselves and about the human condition and the current global pandemic crisis that we're living in at the moment, what it might teach us about the stories that we are telling or may tell about this particular pandemic. So the first story I will start with is Boccaccio's Decameron, which was written in 1348. Boccaccio was writing in Florence. He was actually in Florence during the 2nd year of what became known as the bubonic plague or the Black Death, which lasted a pretty long time from 1347 to 1353. This is a book that's not necessarily a novel, but it's a collection of stories and jokes and advice, and it even includes some tragedies. It ultimately becomes a rhetorical game. So the premise of this particular book is that there are 10 days in which the storytellers are leaving Florence and they're going to tell stories to pass the time, and there are 10 storytellers. So there was meant to be 100 stories by the time Boccaccio stopped writing. Each of these storytellers are kind of trying to outdo each other, and so they end up using a lot of humor to cope with the pandemic. And so you get a lot of erotic stories of sexual escapades, and this is really meant to remind readers that sex is an important way of repeopling the world after a plague. Next, you have Ben Jonson's play, The Alchemist, which was performed for the first time in 1610. Johnson was writing this play during a smaller outbreak of the bubonic plague, specifically in London. It started in about 1608 or 1609 and then lasted through 1610. And it ended up closing a lot of the public houses and the theaters in London, including the theater that Johnson was a member of. He uses this outbreak of the bubonic plague as its backdrop. It's a satirical city comedy, and it really looks at what happens when people start profiting off others' vulnerability and gullibility, when they start trying to sell miracle cures. As one character puts it, a miracle cure will fight the plague out of the kingdom in 3 months, and these are really just fake remedies. This is a play that is about the Black Death, but it also takes the disease of human greed and power, and sort of personifies that as a concurrent disease that's happening in this darkly comedic world. Jumping ahead quite a bit in time, Albert Camus' The Plague is probably one of the most well-known stories of plague. This was originally written in French, and it was published in an English translation in 1948. It may have been based on an outbreak of cholera in French Algeria, and other critics, though, suggest that it's really just an allegory about Nazi occupation of France during World War II. This novel is really interesting, especially given the times that we're currently living in, because it talks a lot about the ways in which people, especially authorities, ignore the signs of plague. And then those authorities' optimism tends to downplay the plague's gravity and speed. It looks at the uses of quarantines as a way to control the spread. And in this particular case, there is a cure for this plague, but it's in limited supply. So it starts asking pretty moral and ethical questions about who gets the cure, who's allowed to get the cure. In 1985, Gabriel Garcia Marquez writes Love in the Time of Cholera. Marquez was fascinated by accounts of plague and pandemic, particularly Camus' writing. So these are two that kind of go together really well. Marquez wanted to write his own story. This is a huge novel that spans approximately 60 years. It's a novel about love and the magical power of love and its ability to allow people to live, thrive, and survive in the age of cholera. It's a novel that reminds us, and this kind of is something that Martha Hurley said a little bit ago, that diseases are great equalizers. Pandemics, unlike humans, do not discriminate against people of color, gender, religious affiliations, or socioeconomic status. And that's one thing that this particular novel teaches us. And then my last example is the film. I Am Legend is a film from 2007. It adapts a novel from the 1950s written by Richard Matheson. This is not the first adaptation of Matheson's novel, nor is it really the best adaptation, but I think it's a little intriguing for two reasons. One is that this film looks very carefully and specifically about how the pandemic originates. And the second interesting thing about it is it incorporates a lot of Christian elements in a science fiction film, especially the representation of the main character, Robert Neville, who's played by Will Smith, as a Christ-like character or savior. And given its sort of Christian elements, it's a film that signals that it's about hope for humanity's survival and hope that humanity, sort of along with medical cures for pandemics, can be redeemed and can also be redemptive. So to sort of talk, there are a lot of rhetorical features and strategies these fictions share, but the reason why I want to focus on personification in the pandemic is because personification as a rhetorical strategy gives the human and often inhumane thing human-like characteristics. And so in these stories, the pandemic is often a principal antagonist. Sometimes, as you'll hear me say in just a couple of minutes, it's also a principal villain in these novels that heroes have to fight against. Pre-modern stories like the Decameron or The Alchemist tell us that plague is a kind of specter or a ghost that's an unnatural guest monster, kind of like a boogeyman. And this kind of monster will visit your home if your home is within the boundaries of the city. They specifically had fear of outbreak of plague within crowded spaces. So cities were more ripe with plague than in the countryside. These pre-modern stories tell us that the pandemic is an evil spirit. It might even be the devil himself, a character who's cruel, who tortures and torments his victims and causes great suffering within them, and has this kind of possessive energy where it can move from man to man with great ease. Modern stories like Camus' Plague or Love in the Time of Cholera tend to depict pandemics as tyrants or as terrorists. So Camus' pandemic is very clearly a fascist that people should have seen rising to power, but it still takes them quite by surprise. He describes the pandemic as a threat, a disruptor of people's tranquility and peace. It's an unwelcome visitor that sort of digs in, cancels their travel plans, silences their speech, slowly starts eliminating freedoms, and starts to imprison people or kill them. And it really prevents most of the characters in the novel from imagining a future. However, the upshot is that this version of the plague, as sort of a tyrannical figure, tells us that the plague can be killed, it can die out, and the few who fight against it can sort of eliminate its reign of terror. Meanwhile, Marquez's pandemic is figured as a terrorist, as a kind of foreigner or foreign entity that attacks a place and a people without regard for color, without regard for background, and sort of leaves them in fear of the next attack. So it's a looming presence, even if it's unseen. And because it presents the pandemic as a sort of foreign terrorist, it really shows a lot of xenophobia attached to the ways in which people present and personify pandemics. There's a lot of racism there too. Lastly, postmodern science fiction and films like I Am Legend personify pandemics as something that is very like humans. It's something that may have even been once human and now is going to try and wipe out human existence. So it's a hybrid of human and a scientifically engineered or modified figure that humans make in their own image. And then it backfires as humans turn these kind of inhuman characters into serial killers. And so it gets us to think about what it might mean to take something designed by nature and to reprogram it to work differently, to push at or exceed human limitations through science and medicine, but might also have the consequence of trying to push humans to the edge of their extinction. So the last thing I want to sort of wrap up with is, in our 21st century world, we don't tend to put a whole lot of stock in fiction. We tend to see fictional stories as just entertainment, and we don't really take these stories all this seriously. But I think if we start to really think about how we personify pandemics, and we do so rhetorically, so to do so rhetorically means that these kinds of personifications are not accidental. They're very deliberate and calculated on the writer's part. It makes us start to think about what kinds of human qualities and characteristics we attribute to pandemics and what that teaches us about what it means to be human. So what I think it can teach us is that what we are most afraid of and what we think we are most vulnerable to, this kind of other, usually a person or a group we see as very different from ourselves, and the group that we project our fears on is really our way of demonstrating this other through disease shows that vulnerable, marginalized, or already stigmatized groups like children, women, people of color, non-Christian groups, personifying pandemics in these ways works rhetorically to sort of further marginalize or stigmatize these already vulnerable groups. So we want to be careful, especially as writers, those of us who might be writing about the pandemic today, that we are sensitive to the ways in which we represent disease, and that can be a way to combat our tendencies to dehumanize certain kinds of populations. On the flip side, fiction can teach us what sort of humanity we want to practice in the times of crisis. We can see the ways that characters that are sometimes ordinary people come together in community and come together to fight pandemics for the common good. I think that fiction can comfort us, especially in these times of crisis. One of the things that I think is most useful about reading these stories is that they tell us that the pandemic will end, and we're living in an age of great uncertainty right now about when that will be for us, but we can sort of take comfort in the fact that these stories do have an end. It asks us to think about what kind of humanity we want to persist beyond the crisis, which parts of humanity we want to survive and thrive. And more often than not, these stories tell us we choose to maintain our core values, our goodness, and our rightness, even if our community and our society has gotten a little bit smaller. I think that fiction, so to sort of conclude, I think that fiction, especially historical fiction, teaches us that we will survive, and we will do so through the stories that we tell, and that we will survive by being the best versions of ourselves and humanity. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Dr. Mackey, and sorry for the mispronunciation of your last name. We do have a question for you from Angela Wayland.
Okay. Hi,
Angela, over to
Hi.
you.
I was just wondering, so you mentioned how the pandemics and kind of the different illnesses throughout time have been portrayed differently. I'm assuming that's probably based on, you know, what was going on in society at the time and things like that. But I was just wondering how you think this pandemic might be represented, or even if there's already people writing about it, kind of how it's being represented and how that might be different from how it's been, how pandemics have been represented in the past.
Right. I mean, that's a really good question. I would say some of the representation really does depend on who's doing the talking or the writing, and to whom, what audience they're talking to or writing. In order to prepare for this, I was doing a little bit of reading about how COVID-19 is being represented. And it seems like one interesting move that most writers are making is to try to keep it to the science, so not to humanize it at all, right? Which is a very different, I think, approach to what historical fiction. And just as you said, I think that might be a reflection of our own time, where we're more aware that this is not, where we're more aware of science, right? And what science can do for us, or what it means to sort of think through the technical aspects of disease in those particular ways. Now, that said, you know, there was especially several weeks ago, there were attempts to, and I'm not sure how intentional or accidental they were, but there were attempts to characterize this as the Chinese virus or the China virus, right? Which speaks to some of those kinds of past ways of representing disease as a vulnerable group, or in a xenophobic or even racist way. So I think it's important to, for us, as we're looking at, again, who's talking and who they're talking to really have an ear for, or an eye for, how the disease is represented, and what the purpose of that particular representation is, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. I don't think we have another question. I do think the presentation is fascinating. And the way in which you describe the terrorist, the personification of the disease or the virus in terms of another, it does make me think about some of the terminology that is being used in terms of fighting COVID, in terms of seeing it as a war,
Right.
battle cries, and sort of a way to organize society to respond to it as an enemy. This, of course, might have some positive impacts in terms of people understanding the severity of it, and also the appreciation for those who are carrying the burden and taking on the risks of fighting the disease. But do you have any reflections from your work on that way that we are now understanding the pandemic without personifying it, but analogizing it to
Right.
sort of war and counterterrorism?
Yeah, I think, well, what's interesting is I was just having a conversation about this with my literature students, because we're currently looking at superheroes. And several of my literature students in our discussion, brought up the fact that the people on the front lines, especially healthcare workers, are being represented as superheroes. So you kind of have on the opposite side of that, right? And like superheroes are so much part of our popular culture right now. So on the flip side of that, it's kind of like COVID is this, it could be perceived, I think, in our time as a terrorist, but it's also kind of like this supervillain, like Marvel's Thanos, where I mean, and Thanos is on my mind too, if you know the most recent Marvel movies with Infinity War and Endgame. He wipes out half of all of the cosmos peoples, right? Not just on Earth, but on other planets and other galaxies with the snap of his finger. And I feel like that kind of narrative is getting projected onto COVID in some ways, where it's kind of like this supernatural, maybe not superhuman, but this kind of supernatural or like super powerful entity that especially healthcare workers are fighting against, right? So almost like this kind of battle of not just wills but powers in certain ways, if that makes sense. And I was really grateful to my students for really thinking in those ways in our discussions about superhero fiction. So I think that may be a sign of our times too.
Thanks. Kelly, over to you.
Yeah, hi, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
No. Now you can. I was trying to make my video come on. Hold on. All right. I'm so competent, but I can't figure out how to make my video come on just at the moment. So let me just ask you this. It is really interesting, the ways that we have talked about the diseases, but I wonder if you would, oh, somebody's invited me to start my video. Nice. Hi. I wonder if you would say something about how, when you look through all this literature, how we represent ourselves, right? So the disease is the terrorist or the superhero or the ghost, but I was really interested in the thing you were saying about Boccaccio, that there's this theme, because I've never read the Decameron, of death and yet sex, new life, right? And so there is this regenerative capacity. There's this thing in humanity that just won't be kept down. So what are the other ways that we depict ourselves, right? In the face of pandemic?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question. I mean, Boccaccio says that, Boccaccio primarily seems to suggest, at least to me, that the ways that we can keep going is through humor, right? Like we have to sort of maintain our sense of humor and delight and find places to do that, even if it doesn't seem like that's available to us. The Alchemist also wants to talk about it as humor, and that's probably my favorite one. I'm a huge Ben Jonson fan. But the Alchemist tells us a very different comedic story, which is that, the people who are left in the city, who don't have the means to escape to the country where there's the good, less people, the people who are left are going to be the con artists, the poor, some absurd religious figures. They're usually religious figures are absurd in Jonson's plays, and then the prostitutes, and they're really going to work to. He sort of shows us kind of at our worst, but in a funny way. So he kind of says, we're gonna do the worst things possible to those around us because that's the way we're gonna survive. And that's a little bleak, even though it, when you see that play performed or you read it, it's very effusive, it's very lively, it's very entertaining, but it's there's kind of a bleak vision behind it about what we're going to be like faced with this kind of circumstance. I think that Marquez's story is probably the one where we're going to respond with the best. His story is also a story similar to Decameron's, where sex is important and it's going to keep the population going, but it also the intimacy between couples and the power of love, because love has a real magical power and force in his novel. That's what's going to help. That's the kind of version of ourselves that he really wants to show. And what's really nice about Marquez's story is that it shows this kind of love story endures, and people live to very old age and are still able to feel that kind of intimate love. And that's kind of a great way to really think about how we're going to be in the face of crisis, if that helps answer your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
I'm really enjoying listening to you talk. I feel like I've got I'm hearing a lot of science and some social justice, some and some music, but I'm hungry for the good stories. So thank you for the recommendations of these.
Well, now that we have some time on our hands, maybe, or at least as summer comes, some of these could be good reading lists.
Okay, this was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you again.
We're gonna end the webinar here on this note and on social justice as the core theme of this week. We have another webinar, part of our series next week, which will be returning to Friday. Please find a new link. You have to use for each webinar a new link, which will be made available through the Campus Digest and is also available on the Human Rights Center's website. on this teach-in series. We thank those of you who participated now and hope that many are going to be listening to this incredibly important discussion around the social justice dynamics of the COVID-19 crisis that we're facing. And we will also put the PowerPoint presentations as well as the video on the website and make it publicly accessible to everyone who wants to use these resources for teaching, learning, or research. We wish everybody a very happy Christmas and Good Friday, and hope to hear and see you all again next week.